Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bid Breakfast. Morning, Rob.
Good morning.
Right, so there is a long session for today, so I'm not going to ask you about the weather. We're just going to get straight
It's cold.
into excellent, good. We're going to get straight into the similarities between sports and bidding. So there's a lovely photo there of our recent bids training workshop where we had a bunch of bidders around the table talking about different elements of bidding. And on the back of that, and obviously the World Cup and the Nations Championship coming up, Rob and I had a really interesting discussion around the similarities between the two areas. So we're going to get into some of the detail around that. And the first thing, and this has come up this week and the back end of last week, was picking the right strategy. So there was lots of stuff around this of did England pick the right strategy in the football? Have England pick the right strategy for South Africa on Saturday? And that really got us thinking. So, Rob, a lot of these are your thoughts. Mainly, I don't agree with them. So I'm going to let you go with it, and then we'll have an argument.
Well, because we have to bring it back to bidding rather than just talking about sport, which so we've got a few ham-fisted metaphors in here. So one of the things, if you're not the incumbent, can you out-prepare the incumbent? We'll get back to the incumbent again down the line where there's some other issues. In a lot of cases, you're not going to be able to out-resource them. They've got all the knowledge, all the information. They're running it at the time. But if you approach it in an organized, disciplined way, you can potentially find your way through. And there are plenty of other factors in that as well. The best example on here from a sporting point of view is those of you who were old enough to remember Greece winning the 2004 European Championships. They were an absolutely awful bunch of individual players. They weren't fantastic. They were, I think one might have played for Leicester City. That's the best I can think of. But
What's an
they were
accolade?
so... Sorry, which one?
What's an accolade?
Oh, yeah, what an accolade. Yeah, definitely. But they were so disciplined, so organised, and they knew the only way they could win was one particular way, which was to soak up the pressure and try and hit them on the break. It was hanging on in there for as long as possible, and they did it. But that is a very narrow path to victory, but it's always still possible if you get everything right. And the same works in bidding. So there you go. Don't bid on everything. That's the whole pick your fixtures point of view. Now, you can't necessarily pick your fixtures in sport, but we'll gloss over that to a certain extent. But you can, and you see this in the Premier League sometimes, is that lower teams will pick the fixtures that they're going to focus on. They know if they play Man City, it's a bit of a write-off as much as anything, but they know they've got a big 6-pointer against somebody in the bottom three, and they'll really go for it. And use your subs. This is the worst metaphor of the three, I'd happily say. But understand, and this is where our multi-draft process comes in as well. You know, layering each element. Well, if you get to the end of draft one and go, well, we haven't got the right people on this. I don't necessarily mean the writer or the manager, but it might be that you need to bring in a different SME. You might need to bring in a different bit of expertise from outside as well. But use those opportunities throughout the match/bid to bring in those new skills as you need to.
So a couple of things. I think there's one thing that's definitely worth pointing out, which is assuming that people think Tuchel's a reasonably good manager. And some people will say yes, some people will say no.
Well, speaking to my dad, who's a Chelsea fan, he liked Tuchel, and he's not easily impressed, my dad. So,
well, there we go. Based on the fact that Rob's dad likes him, I think we can say he's a reasonably good manager. His win rate is just less than 60%. So I think that's one of the things to get in context here, is even though he's reasonably good, his win rate is 60%. Now, the people we work with across multiple sectors, some acceptable win rates might be 25% for particularly competitive, price-sensitive sectors. Other areas, we might be looking at more along the lines of 80% plus. But it's setting the expectations in there around what you can be expected to win. And I think there's just a couple of points, Rob, on the pick your fixtures ones just occurred to me. So I think in sports, sometimes you can pick your fixtures, and it would be under the guise of what's the best way to the final. So do you finish first or second? And actually, that sometimes is an interesting metaphor again for how you find your route through. And again, that's the same for bidding. So, you know, how do you get through each stage of the bid? Where do you want to position yourself? But the other is when you've got a game, you know, like if you've got a minnow against a Man City, is it an opportunity to either make a name for yourselves and come up with some amazing strategy that there's a 1 in 100 chance of winning, or do you use it as a training game and put your young players on there? And that might be the same for a bid, where you've got junior bid writers, managers, apprentices. You think, well, we're not going to win it anyway, but we've got to bid for whatever reason, and we'll probably come on to that at some point. Do you use that as a training game for your bid team, where you just give people a no blame chance to go and have a go and develop and actually see what a live process is like? So, I mean, we obviously know the result of England Congo now.
Absolute crushing win, wasn't it?
Thankfully, we got there. The other one, which we're going to probably talk a little bit more about, is for Saturday, where England rugby are playing South Africa in South Africa. So it's going to be a very, very interesting game, that one. But we'll come on to that as we get through the slides. But I think ultimately, and this is the responsibility of the bid director, bid manager, and again, as we've said on many webinars, that might not be a single person in your organisation. You might be the bid manager and bid director and bid writer, but the role is what we're talking about here. So pick the strategy, set the strategy for everybody else. There's a whole lot of tactics as well that we're just going to talk through, and there's probably a little bit of crossover, and we've just artificially separated them for today. But again, Rob, a lot of these are yours, and you know, I've purposely put Arsenal on there just because it's a demonstration.
You should have put a corner routine on there. So
yeah, well, I didn't want to send everybody to sleep too much, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway,
well,
before we get to boring Arsenal,
but there's another point on this actually. So yeah, I'm an Arsenal fan. I apologise to everyone, but yeah, they won the league this year, and I don't think anyone can really say it was particularly thrilling football. Probably completely at odds with what you'd normally expect from Arsenal, and actually even what Arsenal were like when Arteta initially took over. It's quite interesting how Arteta adapted rather than going, oh, do you know what, really lovely attacking football, but we keep finishing second. Think about being pragmatic and like where are those gains that we can get to the next stage? Well, set pieces was thought of as a relatively easy win. It's something you can practice over and over again. And if you've got big, strong players and people that can deliver things into the box really well, then it's something you can do. And obviously that worked out very well. But the element to that is they practiced and practiced and practiced. They brought in the set piece coach as well, which I know a lot of other teams now have. But I mean, they weren't the underdog in this. Some people might think they were the underdog, maybe sometimes compared to Man City with their limitless resources. But they had to find that next step up, and it was doing that, practicing and practicing. You can do that in bids as well. You know, it's a bit trickier when people have got their day jobs, but if you are in a business development team, practice, 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 and preparation. Whether that's using live bids as practice or finding other ways to do practice. Can you run a mock bid in the team? The problem in our industry is often that we only ever do the writing on the live bids that actually matter, and we don't do enough to practice outside of that and understand where we can improve. So I've gone off on a bit of fun there, but the point is prepare, and that's how Arsenal won it. I don't think there's any particular team in the World Cup where I've seen is massively prepared. If you look at France, they've got 11 fantastic players and they just give them the ball. I'm being a bit unfair to the coach, but what else is there to do? You might see a team come through the middle who are incredibly prepared and can do something, but we'll see. And rather than boring people more about Arsenal, I'm going to hand over to you for your South Africa bit, because I'm not au fait with rugby, so I'm interested.
So this was a really interesting one, and for those people that follow the rugby, there's, you know, for the last 10 days, everything's been around Henry Pollock. South Africa are going to target him. There's all sorts of South African rugby players who've come out and said he's going to have a hard time over there, and I think he's up for it. One of probably the most clever and insightful comments I heard was, and this was somebody that knew Steve Borthwick, being Borthwick, he might not pick him. I thought, what an interesting tactic that the South Africans are hell-bent on focusing on Pollock. That's their motivation. That's their inspiration for the game. That's the thing that's going to get them fueled up. And if you don't pick him, he's not there. So take away the advantage. And I thought that was a really good example of just thinking slightly outside the box. Now he probably will get picked. And I don't know, in fact, I don't know if the team's out yet. I need to check that. But what a great idea for taking away somebody's advantage. So don't always use the expected tactic. Don't always do what you've always done. Start to think around the edges and just see if there's other ways that you can put yourself in the best position. Now, just sort of moving on to the next points. Whatever tactics you start the bid with or the game with, there are things that you'll be able to test. So, for example, the Colts rugby team that I coach now because my knees are broken and can't play anymore. What some of the things that we would always do is put up a big high ball for the fullback, see if he can catch, send a big runner at 10 to see if he can tackle, and see what the scrum's like on the first scrum. Based on those three things, and there's more, but those are the examples, we might adapt our strategy to the result of those three tactics there. So if we know that we've got a fullback that can't catch, and our original strategy was down the middle, control the wind and the rain and do whatever we can, all of a sudden it might change. So whatever you start the bid as, don't feel like you've got to stick to that strategy or those tactics. And this is particularly important because those three examples there are essentially clarification questions. So if you put in a clarification question and you get an unexpected answer, that may well give you an opportunity to change your strategy and tactics. The other things are just around playing what's in front of you. So one of the best rugby coaches I had was just heads up rugby, and a lot of what we did was scenario based stuff. So here's something unfolding. How do you react to it? But based off that, we would then set ourselves targets of we want to score in the first 10 minutes and dominate those first 10 minutes, or actually against a different sort of team in a different set of weather conditions, we don't want to concede in the first 10 minutes. So again, just play what's in front of you. Not every bid's the same, and we see that even though it might be the same service, the same product in the same region, the bid might be different. So play what's in front of you. And sometimes there might be opposite strategies, and they might be appropriate. Rob, I'll just start this one, then you can come in on this, because I watched a really interesting documentary a while ago, and it was about England cricket and the amount of analytics capacity that they've got in there and how that's changed the game. So again, back to bidding, use data to inform your approach. And we talk about this a lot in qualification, using data, understanding what you win, what you lose, what you're close on. But England cricket pretty much know most scenarios they're going to play out. So the one that really got me was on the toss. So before the game's even started, when you flip that coin, if you're at Trent Bridge and you win the toss, the team that bats first wins 75% of the game. I'm just making this up. But play the percentages because they will know, whether you're at Lords, whether you're abroad, if you're playing India with a whole load of different pitchers and spinners, the percentage play they always know based on years and years and years of data and analysing that data. And it's the same in the film Moneyball with the Oakland A's. It was percentage. We don't need the best players. All we've got to do is fill the gaps to get us on base in that case. So there's a whole load of different opportunities you've got with data. And this is particularly important for those smaller teams. And, you see that with the Oakland A's. England cricket, I think part of that capacity developed when they were in one of those slumps. And that's off the, like you get these periods in bidding where you don't win a few and there's a dominant player in the market. So at those times, particularly at those times, use that data. Rob, is there anything you wanted to say on that?
Yeah, I think just a kind of slight counter to that. Knowledge is power, but don't be a slave to the data. So the example was, 80% of the time you win if you bat first at Trent Bridge. Not if it's like grey skies and the opposition has a swing bowler, for example. So you do have to give some nuance and human element to it as well.
Do you want to finish off on the last point?
Yeah. I mean, maybe this goes with last night. I mean, try not to concede an early goal. So, in bidding terms, that's essentially failing at compliance level. And I have worked with bidders who can't get past the first hurdle at SQ level. And these days, you have to do the SQ and ITT at the same time. We've written the best ITT in the world. They couldn't pass SQ, so it was never read. They essentially lost. Even before it kicked off, frankly, that yeah, not worth doing. Always check that.
Right. So let's move on to the different types of opportunities that we might be looking at and potentially some of the strategies for those. So there's just examples. There's a lot more out there that people might be bidding on at the moment, but frameworks where they're unlimited and capped, so the amount of suppliers is unlimited. That's what we're saying with that one. Ranked frameworks where, again, it might be unlimited, or there might be a cap on the number of suppliers, but ultimately somebody's coming first, second, third, and so on. Restricted processes where there is a number of bidders that are invited, and open processes where, and these terms are general terms, so technically there are differences from what I've just said, but we're using this in a general sense. So open processes where it's open to anybody. Some of the other things we talk through, particularly when we write proposals for people rather than bids, is the B2B proposals and also the B2C and the strategies you might employ for those. So certainly around unlimited frameworks, Rob, I think back to a healthcare company that we worked with a long time ago now, but certainly in the last decade, where they were not particularly big, but they were quite good at what they did. And they knew that they couldn't win competitive opportunities against the bigger players in the market. So their entire strategy was around let's get on frameworks and let's do very well in terms of scoring to get on the frameworks. And they had a very, very good business based on that. And that was a purposeful strategy that they developed because they'd obviously looked at their wins and losses and worked out that there was literally there was very little point competing against some of the bigger players because they just didn't have the credentials. And I think the ranked ones as well, there's an interesting mindset to that. So even though it might be minimum standard and you just got to tick the boxes to get on, essentially what you want to be doing is finishing that first spot so that you are at the top of the list when buyers are looking at that list. And particularly for certain things, whether that's social value or the service or the product or the quality or whatever it might be, that's a real opportunity for you to put yourself up there in lights. And I think there's some interesting thinking around ranked and unranked and what you want to achieve.
We've managed to get some underdogs quite high on ranked frameworks.
Yeah.
And again, they were companies that probably would have struggled in a single procedure. Whereas the rank frameworks, because there's not a value attached to it initially, you can get them quite high up, even if they're quite small. Yeah. I think one of the companies, they've got hundreds of thousands of pounds off of that, which wouldn't have happened necessarily. Well, they might have got there if we bid, 10 single supplier contracts. They might have got there in the end. But they didn't need to. They just got on the right framework and were trusted enough to be given the work.
Yep. And the next two, these are interesting again in the approach and the strategy that you'll take to these. So if we're taking restricted as in a limited number of suppliers have been invited, we know in theory that there is a small pool of bidders that the buyer is particularly interested in. So we know it's going to be ultra competitive. Whereas the open process, maybe half the field is not even really in the game. So again, I think we've got, when you are sat there as bid director, bid manager, you've got to be trying to work out who's the opponent here. What are we going to do? So, I mean, there's a whole day's worth of discussion around that, I think. But I think those are the key points of understanding who the competition is and then developing a strategy based on that, as opposed to, well, we'll just go in with our normal strategy.
Yeah.
And I think these are the next two are the most interesting, Rob, when we were talking this through, was quite often with those, well, all the time with those top four, you will get a very detailed set of rules and scoring system. and you know exactly what the rules of the game are. You know exactly what you've got to do to score maximum marks. Whereas a lot of the stuff we do that's B2B outside of the public sector, probably half, as a rough figure, don't publish an evaluation system, even though, you know, in most cases we would ask for it and they would say, there is no evaluation system that we want to publish. We will read the proposals and decide who's going to win. And that's a really interesting strategy that you've got to employ them, because that relies on you knowing the bidder, and also understand the link between their procurement team and the buyer. Right?
There's a change in language as well. And it depends who you're bidding to as well, because in those top 4 ones, it's our what, how, why, when. It's very methodical, hit the marks. If you don't have any marks that you know to hit, how on earth do you approach it? Well, find out the problem, but it's probably a lot of more visually attractive, I'd say. A lot more visually attractive, because you generally have the option to do that. But it probably does steer towards maybe a little bit more marketing speak, a bit more wow than the methodical approach, as long as you can still meet their problems and their requirements.
Yeah, definitely. And just on that wow, I mean, that takes us nicely into the B2C. So we've got a couple of clients that sell directly to consumers. And again, you know, in both instances, there are multiple providers in their space. So it is really about how you attract that one person. And that those guys are, you know, heavily into data, social media feeds, all that sort of stuff. So that completely different strategy that you would employ for B2C to the top 4 points there. So again, it's interesting to think about those different strategies, what sort of things that you would bring in to your thinking to get you over the line for those things. Let's just move on to the sort of 3 categories that we have separated companies into here. So we've got the SME and underdog. So we work with a lot of small businesses. We've worked with micro businesses, you know, people that are less than £1 million turnover, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 employees, just trying to get into a particular sector. But Rob, a lot of these are things that you have been thinking about, and I think particularly in terms of how the bid's written. Do you want to just run through the first few of those?
Well, to go back, let's just bring it slightly back to sport very quickly. So I think a good example of an underdog, although I think a lot of people aren't considering them as underdogs now, but Norway. I don't know if Norway has ever really qualified for a World Cup, and if they have, it's probably back in the mists of time. Norway have 2 world-class players would be considered. If you could name any other members of the squad without having detailed football knowledge, I would be very surprised. I can. And I've played a lot of Football Manager, and I can't name any. They've got Haaland, they've got Ødegaard. They build everything around those 2. If those 2 can make the magic happen, it's usually Ødegaard making the magic happen, Haaland doing the scoring. The rest of the team is set up to help them be as good as they can be, and at the moment, that's working. If you're an SME or an underdog, what are the things? What are your USPs? For Norway, their USPs are Haaland and Ødegaard. If in bidding, what's your USPs? How can you focus on them? Will the client even care about them, or can you spin them to get to where you need to be? So that's just one way of looking at it on those USPs with an SME and an underdog. But yeah, have you got anything? My anaesthetic's kicking in a strange way at the moment. Sorry, I had feelings earlier. So
so that takes us on to the last but one point, which is potentially as a smaller business, you may be cheaper with less overhead. So again, as you are working through your strategy, that's something to consider. And the other thing is maybe you're hyper local because you are an SME and you can really maximize social value. So Rob,
it goes back to the data and the preparation as well earlier as well, doesn't it, that we talked about? No, there's overlap, but you have to get everything right, focus on your USPs, and hope you can thread the needle through to a victory.
Yeah. Then we get to the sort of stuck in the middle, and this was a phrase that I'd sort of coined for a report. So we did a piece of work a long time ago now with a construction firm in the southeast, and they were a reasonable sized company. They weren't a one-man band, but they certainly weren't a tier one company. And at the end of it, this was the phrase that I'd sort of settled on, which was they were essentially stuck in the middle because they were too big to sort of compete for the really small jobs, and they'd got a bit of infrastructure and overhead to deal with, but they just couldn't compete with the tier ones. So for those people, this is a really difficult place to be, and it's almost that sort of like mid-table
like being Everton.
whatever sport you're in, where you've really got to focus, and ultimately you've got to be realistic about what you can achieve. So if you are a mid-table side and you sort of stood there, very, very rarely are you going to win the league, whatever that might be, or the medal or the competition. So I think the things to focus on really are you more resilient than the micro businesses and one-man bands and the very small companies? Probably yes, you are, because you're at that size where you've got infrastructure. Not always saying it's good, but that's something you can probably focus on. The other thing might be is that you potentially might have more accreditations. But again, because of your size, and you've probably got more money to spend, and you've probably got people in there that bring an expertise around, whether it's safety, environment, IG, security, those sorts of things. And the other really interesting thing is what the tier, and I'm saying tier ones here for the like bigger players, so it's just a generic term, but what are the tier ones not interested in? And those are opportunities where potentially, if you are this stuck in the middle company or business, you are probably the favourite for those. So, when Rob was talking on one of the first slides about picking your opportunity, this is one of those examples where you might want to pick the opportunity. The other thing is, and this was off the back of, we've put Emma Raducanu on there. She won the US Open at a very young age. She was sort of middle of the world rankings, probably slightly towards the better end. But it was extremely difficult to maintain those high levels after that. And this is what we see with a lot of stuck in the middle businesses, is they do very, very well on one opportunity, but then because it's a big opportunity, they then have to go off and run that contract. And that takes a lot of focus away from them bidding on the next ones. And then that links on to managing the board's expectations. So you've won a big contract and the board say, right, well, we want to win another one. And actually the infrastructure isn't there. So for me personally, being stuck in the middle ground here is very, very difficult.
Well, it's almost interesting. I was thinking about the Emma Raducanu thing. There was, because I think she won in 2021 is what I want to say, something around that time, 2022.
Yeah.
But there were some interesting sports results that happened during the middle of COVID. Okay, COVID was a very strange thing that happened, but people took their opportunities, and a very ham-fisted way I'm looking at that is people got sick, people got ill, and some of the middle players were able to come through and take those opportunities. The biggest one that happened is in cycling. Some of the Grand Tours were won by people who have done absolutely nothing since. That is their one-offs, and they haven't been able to meet those expectations and command the salaries that they expected off the back of that.
Then we get on to the sort of tier one dominant players in the market. So, and these are questions that are really, really important if you're in that space. How do we stay at the top? Who's the chasing pack? What are they good at? What do we need to protect against? Which is slightly different to Rob's 2 points at the bottom there. Not to say that either are wrong, but the first thing is don't lose what you've got. And then obviously that's the last point there, which is how do we retain what we have? Once you're up there, everybody wants to be where you are, so everyone's trying to take things away from you. It's very, very difficult to stay at the top of the game. Whether Tiger Woods being world number one for a ridiculous amount of time over 10 years, maybe Phil Taylor in darts. There's probably not many other sports. Maybe anyway. There aren't many examples where you can stay up there for a long, long time. Rob, do you want to just finish these last 2 points because
we've worked with incumbents quite often, and some of the things they've said is, but the commissioners know us. Why do we need to say that? Well, and that goes to the point they assume it's going to be theirs because they've been performing well, but they don't necessarily put that on the page. And they think, we can just use the same bid we did before, the one that won before. We can use the relationships we've got, which might still be good, but somebody else is coming into this with absolutely nothing to lose. they can promise the world. And we've seen that before, where even good incumbents can get beaten. And sometimes you've got the curse of too much knowledge being the incumbent as well, which kind of hamstrings you and going, well, we can't do things in our own way. It's a bit of a mixed point, the last one. There is an element to where you do need to play to your own strengths. That obviously you don't work in complete isolation. You do need to understand who your competitors are. But you need to, what are you good at? And this doesn't just go with the SMEs we're talking about before, it goes with everyone. What are you good at? Focus on that. If you need to innovate and do something else as well, that's another point as well. But see where you are, see what you're good at, focus on that.
Excellent. Fine. So just in terms of general principles, because we're pretty much at time now, these are things that we've seen over the years where people have said, we want to do something different. The bottom line is give the buyer what they've asked for. So, you know, there's an example in the construction sector where the spec says this and the supplier says we don't want to do that, we'll do something else. Give them what they've asked for. Leave your politics at home. We worked with somebody years ago who didn't agree with social value and refused to do it. Obviously lost 10% straight away. Take away your opponent's advantage. And that might be, and this is just an example, it might be that you can be particularly competitive in your pricing. It might be something else that you've got. But focus on taking away your opponent's advantage in some circumstances. That should not be the sole strategy. That should be part of it. And do what you're good at. So it might be, if you're a hyper-local firm or you're very good at social value, that might be one area. There will be others. But also be prepared to compromise. So what you want to do might not be what the customer wants. And to win it, you're going to have to give the customer what they want. So be prepared for a compromise. Rob, very quickly, do you want to just finish those last 2 points?
Yeah. The comparison with VAR, well, technology doesn't care what you think or what your opinion is. In theory, it's binary with VAR, but we'll not go into detail on that. I think Hawkeye's a bit better than that, actually, in cricket. You've got to follow what it's saying. You can't muck about. Now, look, if a marking scheme is ambiguous, ask a clarification question, okay? Always use clarification questions in those cases. Otherwise, you've got to go with what it says and you've got to interpret it as it happens. Otherwise, you don't have a leg to stand on. The other thing is maybe don't pat yourself on the back if you get a high score but you still lose. You've got to understand why, okay? Finishing second place with high quality scores but losing on price isn't much fun for anyone.
Still a loss, isn't it? Ultimately, where we're trying to get to with this is competitive advantage. Like one of the best examples of this, and this is all linked to these points, is understanding the game and the rules. That's really important, what you can and can't do. But understand your competition, understand your limitations, understand your strengths, and understand the likely tactics that you and others will use. Build that into a strategy, but also have a backup, because as we've talked about for the last half an hour, things change within the game, things change within the bid. But the best example of this was that England 2003 World Cup final, where Johnson and Wilkinson both knew the rules of the game. They understood all of this. They understood the strengths, weaknesses, the whole lot. And they worked their way down the field to get into that position where Wilkinson could kick the drop goal. Now, that for me was a perfect example of how they pulled all this together and won the game under pressure. And I think that's the biggest thing here, is it is a pressurized environment if you are doing it properly and if you're serious about winning. So you've got to be able to deal with that pressure, you know, particularly in that last week as things get a little bit hectic. Whoever's the bid director, bid manager should be controlling that, making sure that it doesn't get on top of people. But ultimately, this is what your strategy wants to get you to, is the chance to win. Right. Is there any last thoughts from you, Rob?
No, carry on.
Fine. We're not going to cover that because we're out of time today. Obviously, you'll be able to see it. I'll leave it on the screen for a few seconds. Thanks for joining us. Sorry we ran out, but it was a big session today. There's a lot to get through there. Hopefully, that's been interesting. We will be back in 2 weeks' time on the 16th of July. So hopefully,
when England will still be in the tournament.
Yeah, hopefully, and there definitely won't be any sports metaphors. We've done that for a year and scratched that itch. So we'll see you all in 2 weeks' time.
Cheers.